I'm Sophia, 29, and last Sunday at family dinner, my older brother Marcus casually announced he was moving into my house rent-free because he needed to get back on his feet after his divorce. Everyone nodded like it was perfectly reasonable. What they didn't know was that 3 months ago, I'd secretly bought the house from our parents for $480,000 cash while they assumed I was still their broke tenant. When Marcus started packing, I had the sweetest surprise waiting for him. Sometimes being underestimated is the best advantage. Before we dive into this explosive family property drama, what do you think could shock a family who assumes their daughter is still struggling financially? Drop your wildest guesses in the comments below, smash that like button, and subscribe for more incredible family revenge stories where the overlooked sibling gets the ultimate last laugh. You won't believe how this property surprise completely changed our family dynamics forever. To understand why Marcus's announcement was so outrageous, I need to explain the complicated living situation that had defined our family for the past 5 years. After college, I'd moved back into my childhood home while working as a junior marketing coordinator and struggling to save money for my own place in an increasingly expensive housing market. My parents, Linda and George Martinez, owned a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a desirable neighborhood that had appreciated significantly in value over the years. They'd bought it 25 years ago for $180,000, and it was now worth nearly $500,000. The house had become their primary retirement asset and the foundation of their long-term financial planning. Initially, my return home was supposed to be temporary, maybe 6 months to build up savings and find my own apartment. But the arrangement worked well for everyone involved. I paid them $800 monthly in rent, which helped with their mortgage and household expenses, while I saved money by avoiding the $2,000 plus rent I'd face in my own apartment. My parents appreciated having help with household maintenance, yard work, and general upkeep that became more challenging as they entered their 60s. I handled grocery shopping, minor repairs, and technological problems that frustrated them. The arrangement felt mutually beneficial rather than parasitic. Marcus, my older brother by 4 years, had taken a completely different path after college. He'd married his college girlfriend Rachel immediately after graduation, moved to another state for work opportunities, and seemed to have achieved the kind of independent adult life our parents hoped both their children would build. For years, Marcus was held up as the successful child who'd launched properly into adulthood, while I was viewed as the daughter who'd struggled to achieve independence and needed family support to get established. The narrative wasn't entirely unfair. Marcus did appear more financially stable, more professionally advanced, and more settled in his personal life. But appearances were deceiving, as I would later discover. Marcus's marriage had been troubled for several years, though he'd hidden the problems from our family. His career had stagnated after a series of poor job choices and workplace conflicts. His financial situation was precarious due to overspending, poor investment decisions, and the costs of maintaining a lifestyle that looked successful from the outside. When Marcus and Rachel divorced 8 months ago, the financial reality of his situation became impossible to hide. The divorce settlement required him to sell their house and split the proceeds, but after paying legal fees, dividing assets, and covering Rachel's settlement, Marcus was left with minimal cash and no place to live. More problematically, his credit score had been destroyed by missed payments and debt accumulation during the marriage troubles. He couldn't qualify for apartment rentals that required credit checks, and he couldn't afford the deposits and first month's rent that most landlords required. Marcus had been staying with friends and sleeping on couches for 3 months, but those arrangements were temporary and becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. He needed a stable living situation where he could rebuild his finances and figure out his next steps. Our parents were sympathetic to Marcus's situation and wanted to help, but they also had practical concerns about their own financial stability. Dad was planning to retire within 2 years, and they needed to maximize their income during this transitional period. That's when they developed what seemed like a perfect solution. Marcus could move into the house with me, splitting the $800 monthly rent payment and household responsibilities. From their perspective, this arrangement would provide Marcus with affordable housing while maintaining their rental income and giving me help with expenses. What made this plan particularly appealing to our parents was their assumption that I'd welcome Marcus's presence and financial contribution. They believed I was struggling to afford the $800 monthly rent and would appreciate splitting it with my brother. They also thought having Marcus around would provide me with family companionship and support. They'd floated this idea to me casually several months ago, and I'd responded non-committally without rejecting it outright. I hadn't wanted to create conflict or reveal my actual financial situation, so I'd simply said we could see how things develop with Marcus's housing needs. But our parents had interpreted my non-rejection as agreement, and they'd apparently been discussing the arrangement with Marcus as if it were settled. From their perspective, both their children would benefit from shared housing costs, mutual support, and the stability of living in the family home. What they didn't understand was that my financial situation had changed dramatically over the past year. My marketing career had accelerated beyond anything they'd expected, and I'd been secretly building wealth while maintaining the appearance of struggling to get established. I'd received a promotion to senior marketing coordinator with a substantial salary increase, started a successful freelance consulting business on the side, and made some excellent investment decisions that had grown my savings significantly. Instead of barely affording my $800 rent, I was actually building serious wealth while living far below my means. More importantly, I'd been researching the possibility of buying the house from my parents. The arrangement of paying rent while building no equity had started bothering me, especially as I watched property values increase throughout the neighborhood. I wanted to build wealth through homeownership rather than subsidizing my parents' retirement through rent payments. 6 months ago, I'd begun having informal conversations with my parents about potentially purchasing the house. They'd seemed interested in the concept, particularly since it would provide them with a substantial cash payment they could invest for retirement income. But they'd assumed any purchase arrangement would need to involve financing, extended payment plans, or family loans that would complicate everyone's financial situation. They couldn't imagine that their daughter who paid $800 monthly rent might have saved enough cash to buy their house outright. 3 months ago, I'd surprised them with a formal offer to purchase the house for $480,000 cash, slightly above market value to ensure they received fair compensation for their retirement asset. The transaction had closed quietly, with minimal family discussion and no involvement from Marcus, who was dealing with his divorce proceedings at the time. Our parents had been amazed by my ability to secure financing and complete the purchase, though I'd let them assume I'd gotten an excellent mortgage rather than explaining that I'd paid cash. They were thrilled to receive the money for their retirement planning and happy that the house would stay in the family. But we'd agreed to keep the ownership change quiet until after Marcus's divorce was finalized, partly to avoid complicating family dynamics during an already stressful period. Our parents continued living in the house as my tenants, paying me $1,200 monthly rent, while I maintained my same bedroom and continued the illusion that we were all just family members sharing space. Marcus had no idea that the house now belonged to his little sister rather than his parents. And now he was about to announce his intention to move into property I owned, assuming he could live there rent-free because he was family. Last Sunday's family dinner started normally enough. Mom had prepared her famous pot roast, and we were all gathered around the dining room table that had hosted thousands of family meals over the years. The conversation covered typical family topics: Dad's retirement planning, Mom's garden projects, my work updates, and Marcus's ongoing adjustment to post-divorce life. Marcus seemed more upbeat than he'd been in months, and I could tell he had something important to share. He was animated during dinner, asking lots of questions about the house, the neighborhood, and our parents' future plans. I should have recognized the signs that he was building up to a significant announcement. After we'd finished eating and Mom had brought out coffee and dessert, Marcus cleared his throat and smiled broadly. "I have some news that I think will make everyone happy," he began, looking around the table with obvious satisfaction. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about my living situation, and I've realized that the best solution has been right in front of me this whole time," he continued. "Instead of continuing to crash with friends or trying to find some expensive apartment I can barely afford, I'm going to move back home." Our parents exchanged glances, clearly not surprised by this announcement. I realized they'd been expecting this conversation and had probably encouraged Marcus to make his plans official. "I know Sophia is already living here and paying rent," Marcus said, gesturing toward me with a patronizing smile, "but I think we can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone. I'll move into my old bedroom, help with household expenses, and split the rent with Sophia so she doesn't have to carry the full financial burden herself." He spoke about me like I was a struggling tenant who would be grateful for his financial assistance, rather than the homeowner who actually controlled the living situation. This way, Mom and Dad still get their rental income, Sophia gets help with her expenses, and I get a stable place to live while I rebuild my finances, Marcus continued, clearly pleased with his solution. "It's perfect for everyone involved." Mom nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a wonderful arrangement, Marcus. We've been hoping you'd consider moving back home, and it would be nice for Sophia to have family company and help with the rent." Dad chimed in with his own endorsement, "It makes financial sense for both of you kids, and we'd love having you back in the house. There's plenty of space for everyone." I sat quietly, listening to them plan my living situation without bothering to ask for my input or consent. They were treating the house like a family resource that could be redistributed based on need, rather than private property with an actual owner who might have opinions about new tenants. Marcus was particularly confident about his welcome, speaking as if his return was a generous favor he was doing for everyone rather than a request that required approval. He talked about timeline, logistics, and household arrangements with the assumption that his presence would be universally appreciated. "I'm thinking I'll move in next weekend," he announced. "I don't have much stuff since the divorce, so it should be pretty simple. I can start contributing to rent immediately, maybe $400 monthly since I'll only be using one bedroom." $400 monthly, exactly half of what he assumed I was paying our parents, despite the fact that he'd be using common areas, utilities, and household resources that would increase everyone's expenses. "That sounds very reasonable," Mom said enthusiastically. "Sophia, wouldn't it be nice to have Marcus back home and helping with expenses?" All eyes turned to me, clearly expecting immediate agreement and gratitude for Marcus's generous offer to solve my apparent financial struggles. They were waiting for me to express relief and appreciation that my successful older brother was willing to move in and help his struggling little sister manage her rent payments. I took a sip of coffee, studying their expectant faces while considering how to handle this moment. I could reveal the truth immediately, explaining that I owned the house and had complete control over who lived there. I could let Marcus proceed with his plans and surprise him later when he tried to move in. Or I could play along temporarily while deciding the best way to educate my family about the reality of our housing situation. "That's an interesting proposal, Marcus," I said carefully. "I appreciate you wanting to help with household expenses." My noncommittal response seemed to satisfy everyone at the table. They interpreted my measured tone as acceptance rather than the diplomatic non-answer it actually was. Marcus beamed with satisfaction. "Great. I knew you'd see how much sense this makes. We can figure out details about shared expenses, household responsibilities, and space arrangements once I'm moved in." He began discussing logistics with our parents. Which furniture he'd need, how to arrange shared bathroom schedules, and whether any household rules needed to be established for harmonious cohabitation. They talked about grocery shopping, utility bills, and cleaning responsibilities as if these decisions were theirs to make. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Marcus becoming increasingly excited about his return to the family home. He talked about how nice it would be to have a stable living situation again, how much money he'd saved compared to renting his own apartment, and how helpful it would be to have family support during his financial recovery. Our parents were equally enthusiastic, discussing how wonderful it would be to have both their children living at home again and how much sense the arrangement made for everyone's financial situation. They spoke about family dinners, shared expenses, and mutual support as if we were returning to some idealized version of family life. I listened to this planning session with growing amusement and anticipation. My family was making detailed arrangements for Marcus to move into my house, assuming I was a struggling tenant who would welcome his financial contribution and grateful for his presence. The irony was perfect. Marcus thought he was doing me a favor by offering to split rent payments that I wasn't actually making, while our parents thought they were facilitating a mutually beneficial arrangement in a house they no longer owned. As dinner ended and we began clearing dishes, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Sophia, I really appreciate you being cool about this arrangement," he said, his voice sincere. "I know it's probably been tough managing the rent payments on your own, and I want you to know I'm committed to doing my fair share." "I'm sure everything will work out perfectly," I replied, smiling mysteriously. Marcus interpreted my smile as sisterly affection and gratitude, having no idea that I was already planning the surprise that would completely upend his assumptions about our family's housing situation. To understand the full scope of the surprise I was planning for Marcus, I need to explain how I'd managed to secretly purchase our family home while everyone assumed I was barely scraping by as a tenant. The transformation of my financial situation had been gradual but dramatic, and I'd deliberately kept the changes hidden to avoid family complications and unwanted advice. 18 months earlier, my career had taken an unexpected turn when my small marketing firm was acquired by a larger company that recognized my potential and promoted me to senior marketing coordinator with a 40% salary increase. But the real financial breakthrough came when I started freelance consulting work that leveraged my expertise in digital marketing strategies. What began as occasional weekend projects for small businesses had evolved into a thriving consultancy that generated $3,000 to $5,000 monthly in additional income. I was working with clients across the country, developing marketing campaigns, managing social media strategies, and providing business development consulting that commanded premium rates. The combination of my increased salary and consulting income had boosted my monthly earnings from $3,200 to nearly $8,000, but I'd maintained the same modest lifestyle to maximize savings and investment opportunities. Instead of upgrading my car, clothing, or social activities, I'd continued living like someone earning a third of my actual income. I'd also made some excellent investment decisions during this period, particularly in technology stocks and index funds that had performed well above market averages. My investment portfolio had grown from $15,000 to over $180,000 in just 2 years, providing both passive income and long-term wealth building. But I'd kept these financial improvements completely secret from my family. They continued to see me as the daughter who was struggling to get established, working at a small marketing firm, and needing family support to afford basic housing. This perception served my purposes perfectly, allowing me to save aggressively without family pressure to contribute more to household expenses or help with family financial needs. 6 months ago, I'd begun seriously researching the possibility of purchasing the family home. The idea had started as idle curiosity about real estate investment, but I'd gradually realized that buying the house would solve multiple problems while building significant wealth. First, I'd stop paying rent without building equity, instead investing in property that would appreciate over time. Second, I'd have complete control over my living situation without depending on family generosity or changing circumstances. Third, I'd provide my parents with a substantial cash infusion for their retirement planning while keeping the house in the family. The research process had been complex, involving property appraisals, market analysis, and legal consultation about family real estate transactions. I'd discovered that the house was worth approximately $480,000 based on recent comparable sales in the neighborhood, and that my parents had only $120,000 remaining on their mortgage. More importantly, I'd learned that I could afford to purchase the house outright with cash, avoiding mortgage complications and making the transaction simpler for everyone involved. My savings and investment accounts contained $520,000, leaving me comfortable financial cushion even after a major property purchase. The challenge was approaching my parents about the purchase without revealing the full scope of my financial transformation. I needed them to take my offer seriously while maintaining the fiction that I was still the struggling daughter who paid them $800 monthly rent. I'd started with casual conversations about homeownership and real estate investment, testing their receptiveness to the idea of selling the house to a family member. They'd been intrigued by the concept, particularly since it would provide them with retirement capital while ensuring the property stayed in the family. When I'd finally made a formal offer to purchase the house for $480,000, they'd been shocked that I could secure financing for such a large amount. I'd let them assume I'd gotten an excellent mortgage deal rather than explaining that I was paying cash, wanting to avoid questions about where the money had come from. The transaction had proceeded smoothly, with our family attorney handling the legal work and ensuring that all documentation was properly filed. My parents had been thrilled to receive the $360,000 profit from the sale, which dramatically improved their retirement financial security. But we'd agreed to keep the ownership change quiet for several reasons. First, Marcus was dealing with his divorce proceedings, and family property changes might complicate his legal situation. Second, our parents wanted to continue living in the house as tenants while they decided on their long-term housing plans. Third, I preferred to maintain the current family dynamic while adjusting to property ownership responsibilities. The arrangement we'd established was that my parents would pay me $1,200 monthly rent, enough to cover property taxes, insurance, and maintenance while providing me with positive cash flow from the investment. They'd continue handling yard work and basic upkeep, while I'd be responsible for major repairs and improvements. From the outside, nothing had changed. My parents still lived in their house, I still occupied my childhood bedroom, and the family still gathered for Sunday dinners around the same dining room table. But the fundamental legal and financial reality had shifted completely. I now owned the property where my entire family assumed I was struggling to afford rent as a tenant. The secret ownership had been both liberating and amusing. I'd found myself viewing household improvements and maintenance issues from a completely different perspective, thinking like a property owner rather than a temporary family member. I'd also started researching potential renovations and upgrades that would increase the home's value over time. But keeping the secret had required careful management of family conversations and financial discussions. When my parents mentioned property taxes or homeowner's insurance, I had to resist offering input that might reveal my knowledge of these expenses. When they discussed neighborhood property values or real estate market trends, I had to pretend casual interest rather than the intimate knowledge I developed through ownership research. The most challenging aspect of the secret was watching family members make assumptions about my financial situation and living arrangements. When they discussed family finances, budgeting advice, or housing costs, they continued treating me like someone who needed guidance rather than someone who'd achieved significant financial independence. Marcus's announcement that he planned to move in had created the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth in a way that would completely reshape family perceptions and dynamics. Instead of gradually educating them about my improved financial situation, I could deliver the information as a dramatic surprise that would force everyone to reconsider their assumptions about family success and achievement. The brother who thought he was doing me a favor by offering to split rent payments was about to discover that his little sister was actually the landlord who would decide whether he could live in the property at all. Saturday morning arrived with Marcus showing up at the house at 8 a.m. sharp, driving a rented moving truck and radiating confidence about his planned return to the family home. He'd spent the week coordinating with friends to help move his belongings, organizing his possessions, and making arrangements for what he clearly expected would be a seamless transition into shared living with his grateful little sister. I watched from my bedroom window as he pulled into the driveway, knowing this would be the most memorable moving day of his life. For the past week, I'd been planning exactly how to reveal the truth about property ownership in a way that would maximize the educational impact while ensuring Marcus understood the new reality of our family dynamic. Our parents had left Friday evening for a planned weekend visit with my aunt in Sacramento, timing that was perfect for the surprise I had planned. They'd wished Marcus luck with his move and told him they'd see him on Sunday when they returned to their new rental arrangement, though they still hadn't explained to Marcus that they were now tenants rather than homeowners. Marcus knocked on the front door with characteristic enthusiasm, apparently forgetting that he'd assumed this was still his family home where he could enter freely. When I opened the door, he was grinning broadly and holding a coffee for each of us. "Moving day," he announced cheerfully. "I brought coffee to fuel our big project. My friends will be here in about an hour to help carry stuff, but I wanted to get started with organizing space and figuring out logistics." I accepted the coffee and invited him in, noting how he looked around the living room and kitchen with the satisfaction of someone returning to familiar territory. He was clearly envisioning how the space would work with two adult siblings sharing expenses and responsibilities. "I've been thinking about how to organize everything," he continued, pulling out his phone to show me notes he'd made about room arrangements. "I figured I'd take my old bedroom, we can share the main bathroom, and maybe work out a schedule for kitchen use during busy times." Marcus had obviously spent considerable time planning this living arrangement, developing detailed ideas about shared grocery shopping, utility bills, cleaning responsibilities, and house rules that would ensure harmony between siblings. He was approaching the situation like a thoughtful roommate rather than someone assuming free housing from family. "I want to make sure this arrangement works well for both of us," he said earnestly. "I know you've been managing everything on your own, and I don't want to disrupt your routine or create any complications." His consideration was touching, but it was based on completely incorrect assumptions about who was managing what in this household. "Marcus, before your friends arrive and you start moving boxes, I think we should discuss the living arrangement in more detail," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table and gesturing for him to join me. "Absolutely," he replied, settling into his chair with obvious relief that I was being proactive about establishing boundaries and expectations. "I want everything to be clear and fair from the beginning." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared containing property ownership documents, mortgage information, and lease agreements that would tell the complete story of our housing situation. "First, I think you should understand the current legal and financial structure of this house," I began, sliding the property deed across the table toward him. Marcus glanced at the document casually, clearly expecting routine paperwork about rental agreements or household responsibilities. But as he read the property owner information, his expression changed from casual interest to complete confusion. "Sophia, I don't understand what I'm looking at," he said slowly. "This says you own the house, but that can't be right. Mom and Dad own this house." "Mom and Dad sold the house to me 3 months ago," I explained calmly. "I purchased it for $480,000 cash. They're now my tenants, paying $1,200 monthly rent." Marcus stared at me like I'd just announced I was an alien from another planet. He looked back and forth between the property deed and my face, trying to process information that completely contradicted everything he thought he knew about our family's housing situation. "That's impossible," he said finally. "You pay Mom and Dad $800 rent. You don't have $480,000 to buy a house. How could you possibly afford to purchase this property?" I pulled out bank statements showing my account balances, investment portfolio summaries, and documentation of my consulting income that painted a picture of substantial wealth accumulation over the past 2 years. "Marcus, my financial situation has changed significantly since you moved away," I explained. "I've been promoted at work, built a successful consulting business, and made excellent investment decisions. I'm not the struggling little sister who needs help splitting rent payments." He studied the financial documents with growing amazement and disbelief. The numbers were undeniable: bank balances in the hundreds of thousands, investment accounts showing sophisticated portfolio management, and income statements that revealed monthly earnings exceeding what he'd made annually during his best years of marriage. "Sophia, this is incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "I had no idea you were doing so well financially. But why didn't you tell anyone about this success?" "Because I preferred to build wealth quietly rather than deal with family expectations, requests for loans, or unsolicited advice about money management," I replied honestly. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, clearly recalculating everything he thought he knew about family dynamics, financial success, and his own position relative to his younger sister's achievements. "So when I announced I was moving in to help you with rent," he said slowly, "you were announcing plans to move into my house and offering to help me pay rent to myself," I confirmed. Which was generous, but not exactly how property ownership works. The humor of the situation was finally penetrating his shock. Marcus began laughing, though it was the kind of laughter that comes from recognizing how completely wrong your assumptions have been. "This is unbelievable," he said, shaking his head. I've been feeling sorry for you struggling with rent payments while you actually own the house. I've been thinking of myself as the successful sibling while you've been building serious wealth. I offered to help you with $400 monthly rent payments while you can afford to buy houses with cash. It's a pretty significant perspective shift, I agreed. Marcus stood up and walked around the kitchen, looking at the space with completely different eyes. What he'd seen as the family home where he'd generously help his struggling sister was actually his successful sister's investment property where he'd be a tenant if she chose to allow it. Sophia, I owe you a massive apology, he said, turning back to face me. I've been condescending and patronizing without realizing it. I assumed you needed my help and guidance when you've obviously been handling everything perfectly on your own. I appreciate that, Marcus. But this raises a pretty important question about my moving plans, he continued. If you own the house, then me living here isn't about splitting expenses with a fellow tenant. It's about you deciding whether you want a tenant brother and what terms would work for that arrangement. I smiled, pleased that he was grasping the new reality quickly. Exactly. This is now a conversation between a property owner and a potential tenant, not between siblings assuming equal housing rights. Marcus sat back down, clearly understanding that his confident plans for moving home had just become a formal request for housing that required my approval and could be structured however I chose. So, he said carefully, would you be willing to consider renting me a room in your house? The question hung in the air as Marcus realized that his little sister was now in the position to determine his housing future, and that everything he'd assumed about family support and shared living arrangements had just been completely turned upside down. Marcus's question about renting a room hung in the air while I considered how to handle this complete reversal of our family dynamic. The brother who'd assumed he could move in and generously help me with expenses was now formally requesting to become my tenant, and I had all the power to determine whether that arrangement would work for both of us. Marcus, I'm willing to consider a rental arrangement, I said carefully, but it would need to be structured as a legitimate landlord-tenant relationship with clear terms and boundaries. His relief was visible, but I could also see him processing what a legitimate rental arrangement might mean in terms of cost, responsibilities, and family dynamics. What kind of terms are you thinking about? He asked, clearly nervous about what his successful sister might consider appropriate rent for a bedroom in her property. I'd actually been thinking about this possibility since his divorce began, knowing he might eventually need housing assistance but wanting to ensure any arrangement would be financially beneficial for me while helping him rebuild his life responsibly. Market rate for a bedroom with shared common areas in this neighborhood is about $1,200 monthly, I began, watching his face fall as he calculated what that would mean for his already tight budget. However, I continued, I'm willing to offer family rates with some conditions attached. Marcus perked up slightly, though he looked appropriately wary about what conditions his little sister might impose. I'll rent you the room for $800 monthly, which is what our parents were charging me when I was actually their tenant, I explained. But that rate comes with specific requirements about financial responsibility and household contribution. I pulled out a lease agreement I'd drafted during the week, complete with terms that would ensure Marcus understood this was a business arrangement rather than casual family help. First, rent is due on the first of each month with no grace period. Late payments result in immediate late fees, and consistently late payments result in eviction notice. Marcus nodded seriously, clearly understanding that his little sister wasn't going to be a pushover landlord who enabled irresponsible behavior. Second, you're responsible for your own groceries, personal expenses, and any damage to the property. I'm not subsidizing your lifestyle or covering costs beyond basic housing. That's completely fair, he agreed quickly. Third, you contribute to shared household expenses like utilities, internet, and basic maintenance supplies. I estimate that'll be about $200 monthly on top of rent. So far, the terms were reasonable and Marcus seemed relieved that I wasn't charging him full market rate for housing. Fourth, this is a month-to-month rental agreement that can be terminated by either party with 30 days' notice. I'm not committing to long-term housing regardless of your circumstances. This condition ensured that I maintained control over my living situation and could make changes if the arrangement became problematic. And finally, I said, sliding the lease across the table, you acknowledge in writing that I own this property and that you're a tenant with no ownership rights or claim to family housing. This last condition was important for establishing clear boundaries and preventing future assumptions about family property sharing. Marcus read through the lease carefully, and I could see him calculating the total monthly cost of $1,000 for rent and utilities. It was significantly more than the $400 he'd originally planned to contribute, but still reasonable compared to market rates for equivalent housing. Sophia, these terms are fair and I appreciate you offering family rates, he said after finishing the document. I have one question about the arrangement. What's that? How do we handle the family dynamic of you being my landlord? This is going to be a pretty significant change in how we relate to each other. It was a thoughtful question that showed Marcus was understanding the broader implications of our new relationship structure. Marcus, I think we keep family relationships and business arrangements separate, I replied. During family dinners and gatherings, we're siblings. When it comes to housing issues, rent payments, and property matters, I'm your landlord and you're my tenant. That makes sense, he agreed. And it probably means I need to start treating you with more respect about financial matters since you've obviously been much more successful than I realized. This acknowledgement was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. Marcus was finally recognizing that his assumptions about family financial dynamics had been completely wrong. I'd appreciate that, I said. I've been building wealth and making good financial decisions for years, but everyone in the family still treats me like I need guidance and support. Marcus signed the lease agreement and handed it back to me, officially becoming my first family tenant. When can I move in? He asked. Today, if you want. But I expect the first month's rent and security deposit before you start bringing belongings into the house. Marcus pulled out his phone to check his bank balance, clearly doing mental math about his available cash. I can transfer $1,500 today for first month's rent and deposit, he said. Will electronic transfer work? Perfect. Send it to the account listed in the lease agreement. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with a notification that Marcus had transferred $1,500 to my business account. My brother was officially my paying tenant, and I was earning rental income from the family member who thought he was doing me a favor by offering to help with expenses. This is surreal, Marcus said, laughing as he processed what had just happened. An hour ago, I thought I was moving home to help my struggling little sister split rent payments. Now I'm paying rent to my successful property owner sister who's been secretly wealthy this whole time. Life is full of surprises, I agreed, smiling at how completely the power dynamic had shifted. Marcus's friends arrived shortly after we'd completed the lease signing, and I watched with amusement as he tried to explain the new situation to them. Change of plans, guys, he announced as they unloaded the moving truck. Turns out my sister owns the house now, so I'm renting a room from her instead of splitting expenses with her. His friends looked confused by this development, clearly not understanding how family housing arrangements had become formal rental relationships, but they helped him move his belongings into what was now officially a tenant bedroom rather than his childhood room. As the day progressed, I found myself enjoying the role of landlord much more than I'd expected. Instead of being the family member who needed help and guidance, I was the successful property owner who was generously providing below-market housing to a family member in need. Marcus adapted to his new tenant status remarkably well, asking permission before making any changes to the room, checking with me about household policies, and treating shared spaces with the respect of someone who understood they were living in someone else's property. The best part was watching him recalibrate his entire perception of my competence and success. The sister he thought needed financial guidance was actually the family's most successful member, and he was now dependent on my goodwill for stable housing. Sunday evening brought our parents home from their weekend trip, and I was curious to see how they'd react to discovering Marcus had moved in as my official tenant rather than their assumed family housing arrangement. They returned to find Marcus's belongings settled into his room and a significantly different dynamic between their children than they'd expected. How did the move go? Mom asked cheerfully as she unpacked groceries. It's so nice to have both my children home again. Marcus and I exchanged glances, and I could see him trying to decide how much to explain about our new landlord-tenant relationship versus the sibling expense-sharing arrangement our parents had envisioned. The move went smoothly, Marcus replied carefully, but we discovered some interesting information about the housing situation that changes things significantly. Dad looked up from sorting mail, clearly sensing that something important had developed in their absence. What kind of information? Mom asked, her voice showing mild concern about potential complications. It turns out Sophia owns the house now, Marcus announced simply. She bought it from you 3 months ago for $480,000 cash. I'm renting a room from her as her tenant, not splitting expenses as a fellow family member living in your house. The silence that followed was profound. Our parents stood frozen in the kitchen, trying to process information that completely contradicted their understanding of family housing arrangements and their daughter's financial capabilities. That's impossible, Dad said slowly. We sold the house to Sophia? When did this happen? How could she afford to purchase property? I pulled out the same folder of documentation I'd shown Marcus, spreading the property deed, purchase agreement, and financial statements across the kitchen table for our parents to review. The transaction closed 3 months ago, I explained. I paid $480,000 cash, which is why you received that large deposit in your retirement account. You've been paying me $1,200 monthly rent since then, though we agreed to keep the ownership change quiet until Marcus's divorce was finalized. Mom picked up the property deed with shaking hands, reading the ownership information that clearly listed me as the sole proprietor of the house where she'd assumed she still lived as an owner. Sophia, how is this possible? She asked, her voice filled with amazement. How do you have this kind of money? We thought you were struggling to afford the $800 rent we were charging you. I walked them through my career advancement, consulting business development, and investment success over the past 2 years. They listened with growing astonishment as they realized their struggling daughter had quietly built substantial wealth while maintaining the appearance of needing family support. You've been earning $8,000 monthly and we had no idea? Dad asked, looking at my income documentation. You've been living like someone making $3,000 while saving and investing the difference? I wanted to build wealth without family complications or pressure to contribute to everyone else's financial needs, I explained. It was easier to let you think I was still getting established rather than deal with expectations about family loans or financial gifts. Marcus jumped in to explain his new tenant status and the lease agreement we'd signed that morning. So instead of me helping Sophia split rent payments to you, I'm paying rent to Sophia while you're also paying rent to Sophia. She's basically become our family landlord. Our parents struggled to process this complete reversal of family financial dynamics. The daughter they'd worried about was actually the most financially successful family member, while their successful son was now dependent on his sister's generosity for housing. This is incredible, Sophia, Mom said, her voice filled with pride and bewilderment. We're so proud of your success, but we're also shocked that you've been managing all this while we thought you needed our help and support. I did need your help and support, I replied. Living here while building my business and investments was crucial to my success. But I outgrew the need for financial assistance without anyone noticing because I maintained the same lifestyle. Dad was studying the financial documents with professional interest, clearly impressed by my investment strategies and portfolio performance. Sophia, this is sophisticated financial management, he said admiringly. You've made excellent decisions about diversification, risk management, and growth investments. How did you learn to handle money at this level? Research, online courses, and careful experimentation with small amounts before committing serious money, I replied. I treated financial education like a professional development priority. The conversation continued for over an hour as our parents adjusted to their new understanding of family financial dynamics. They were thrilled about my success but also slightly embarrassed about their assumptions and the paternalistic advice they'd been offering someone who was actually more financially sophisticated than they were. Sophia, we owe you an apology for treating you like you needed financial guidance, Mom said finally. We've been giving you advice about budgeting and career development while you were quietly building wealth and buying property. I appreciate that, but I understand why you made those assumptions. I deliberately maintained the appearance of struggling financially to avoid complications. Marcus had been listening to this family conversation with growing awareness of how completely his perceptions had been wrong about everyone's financial situation. So let me make sure I understand everything, he said. Sophia secretly became wealthy while appearing to struggle. You guys sold her the house and became her tenants while I thought you were still homeowners. And I announced plans to move in and help with expenses in a house that actually belongs to my little sister who's been supporting everyone else. That's an accurate summary, I confirmed. This is the most humbling experience of my adult life, Marcus admitted. I've been condescending to the most successful member of our family while assuming I was the one with superior financial knowledge and stability. Our parents began asking detailed questions about my business operations, investment strategies, and long-term financial planning. They were genuinely interested in learning from my success rather than offering guidance they'd assumed I needed. Sophia, would you be willing to help us optimize our retirement investments? Dad asked. It sounds like you've developed expertise that could benefit our financial planning. This request represented a complete reversal of our family's financial advice dynamic. Instead of parents providing guidance to their struggling daughter, they were asking their successful daughter for professional financial consultation. I'd be happy to review your portfolio and make suggestions, I replied. But I'd want to handle it professionally rather than as casual family advice. The evening ended with our family having a completely different understanding of financial success, professional achievement, and family support systems. The daughter who'd been seen as needing help was actually the family's primary source of financial stability and expertise. Marcus was settling into his new role as tenant rather than returning family member. Our parents were adjusting to being tenants rather than homeowners, and I was being recognized as the financial leader rather than the family member who needed guidance. The family dinner announcement that was supposed to solve Marcus's housing problems had revealed that our assumptions about financial success and family dynamics had been completely backwards for years. 3 months have passed since Marcus's moving day surprise, and our family dynamics have settled into a new normal that reflects the actual financial realities rather than the assumptions we'd maintained for years. The transformation has been remarkable for everyone involved, but particularly educational for those who'd underestimated the quiet family member who'd been building wealth in secret. Marcus has thrived as my tenant in ways I didn't expect. The formal structure of rent payments and lease obligations has actually helped him develop better financial discipline than he'd shown during his marriage. Knowing that housing isn't guaranteed or subsidized has motivated him to manage his money more carefully and prioritize essential expenses over lifestyle spending. He's found a new job with better pay and benefits, partly because he approached the job search with urgency knowing that his housing depended on meeting consistent financial obligations. The stability of having affordable, reliable housing has allowed him to focus on career development rather than scrambling for temporary living arrangements. More importantly, Marcus has developed genuine respect for my financial expertise and business acumen. He regularly asks for advice about budgeting, investment options, and career decisions, treating me as a knowledgeable consultant rather than his little sister who needs guidance. Living here has been the best thing that could have happened to my financial recovery, he told me recently. Having clear responsibilities and consequences has forced me to get my act together in ways that casual family support never would have. Our parents have undergone their own adjustment period as they've shifted from seeing themselves as property owners helping their struggling daughter to recognizing themselves as tenants benefiting from their successful daughter's generosity. The transition required some ego management, but they've ultimately embraced their new role. They've started consulting me about financial decisions, retirement planning, and investment strategies. Dad has implemented several of my suggestions for portfolio diversification, and Mom has started her own small consulting business based on advice I provided about marketing and business development. We're learning to see you as the financial expert in the family rather than the child who needs our guidance, Mom admitted during a recent family dinner. It's been humbling but also exciting to have access to your knowledge and perspective. The rental income from both Marcus and our parents has allowed me to accelerate my investment strategies and consider additional property purchases. I'm now looking at acquiring a duplex as my next real estate investment, with the goal of building a portfolio that will provide long-term passive income. My consulting business has also expanded significantly, partly because the confidence I gained from handling family financial dynamics successfully translated into more assertive client management and higher rates for my services. But the most satisfying change has been the elimination of condescending family interactions and unsolicited advice about my lifestyle choices. Instead of being treated as the family member who needed help and guidance, I'm now recognized as someone whose opinions and decisions should be respected and valued. The experience taught all of us valuable lessons about assumptions, financial success, and family relationships. We'd created a mythology about who was successful and who needed support that was completely disconnected from reality, and maintaining that mythology had prevented honest communication about actual circumstances and capabilities. Marcus learned that divorce and career setbacks don't have to define someone's financial future, but that recovery requires taking responsibility for decisions rather than assuming family will provide unconditional support. The structure of formal rental agreements helped him develop discipline that casual family assistance might have undermined. Our parents learned that financial success can look different than they expected, and that offering guidance based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge can be counterproductive. They've started asking questions about my circumstances rather than making recommendations based on outdated perceptions. I learned that hiding financial success to avoid family complications can create its own problems, and that being direct about capabilities and boundaries often works better than maintaining helpful fictions. I also discovered that I enjoy the clarity of business relationships even with family members. 6 months ago, Marcus thought he was returning home to help his struggling little sister manage household expenses. Instead, he discovered that his successful sister was willing to provide below-market housing in exchange for treating her with appropriate respect and meeting consistent financial obligations. Our parents thought they were facilitating a mutually beneficial arrangement in their family home. Instead, they learned that their daughter had secretly purchased their house and was generously allowing them to continue living there as tenants while building wealth through property ownership. I thought I was maintaining family harmony by hiding my financial transformation. Instead, I learned that revealing the truth created much healthier dynamics based on actual circumstances rather than outdated assumptions. The surprise that was supposed to humble my assumptions about family living arrangements ended up educating everyone about the difference between financial appearance and financial reality. Sometimes the family member who seems to need the most help is actually the one providing the most support. Final call to action. Have you ever been underestimated by family members who didn't know the full scope of your success or capabilities? What's the most satisfying way you've ever revealed that someone's assumptions about you were completely wrong? How do you handle family relationships when there are significant differences in financial success or life circumstances? I'd love to hear your stories about family assumptions, hidden success, and the moment when people realized they'd completely misjudged someone's situation. Drop your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed watching my family discover that their struggling daughter was actually their secret millionaire landlord. Subscribe for more incredible family drama stories where the underestimated family member gets the ultimate last laugh. Share this with anyone who's ever been treated like they needed help and guidance when they were actually the most successful person in the room. Thank you for following my journey from assumed struggling tenant to surprise property owner. Remember that people's assumptions about your success or circumstances don't define your actual capabilities, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is quietly build wealth while everyone else focuses on appearances. The family member they think needs the most help might be the one who ends up helping everyone else, but only if they've earned that support through respect and genuine appreciation rather than entitled assumptions.